So just to run through the structure of what today's going to look like. First, we'll do some introductions, a little bit about us, Scene, and the Net Zero Hub, and then about yourselves. Then I'll hand over to Sandy, one of the directors here at Scene, and he'll take you through the governance part of the workshop, where we'll look at governance structures, capacity in governance, how partnerships might work in different governance structures. And then we'll have an activity based on partnership and governance. And depending on how we're doing with time, we might have a 10-minute break. Then we'll come back for the procurement part of the workshop, where you'll hear from myself, and we'll go through things like management in procurement, decision-making, and the practicalities of actually going through the procurement process. And that will be followed by another activity. And then at the end, after a second break, there'll be a roundtable discussion where you can share some of your experiences, and then there'll be a chance to give plenty of questions and get some answers from us before we finish up. So just something to highlight before we begin. So we really want this to be an interactive workshop, as we've included these activities. So while you will obviously be listening to Sandy and myself discuss various principles on governance and procurement, we also recognize that there will still be a wealth of experience sat in this room from you guys, whether you realize it or not, and you've probably all experienced some like barriers or enablers relating to this topic that hearing those experiences could be valuable for someone else in that room. So we're really keen to get you discussing. So first off, we'd like to know a little bit about you. So very briefly, if we could just have your name, your organization's name, and maybe the governance structure that your organization has, and then anything about your community energy project. So I'll just go through the people in the room one by one. If you could unmute yourself and maybe turn your camera on, and we can hear a little bit about yourself. So Caroline Greenwood, we could start with you.
Hi, I'm with the Upper Don Community Energy Group, just north of Sheffield in the Stocksbridge, Penistone area. And I think that we're a cooperative community group. And we have 3 arms to our group, and at the moment, the community energy bit is we're exploring whether it's feasible to have a community energy source in a cricket club and possibly other community-owned buildings and church, such as the church in a small village that's off gas, doesn't have mains gas.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. Be interested to hear more about that later on in the workshop. Catherine.
Hi there. I'm Catherine. I work at Broadacres Housing Association in North Yorkshire. We don't currently have any community energy projects yet. Yeah, so I'm just kind of here to kind of gain a bit of knowledge in terms of if we were to kind of get involved, how would that work? What kind of skills could we bring to that? So yeah, that's me.
Great, yeah, sounds like you're in the right workshop then. Helge?
Hi, I'm Helge Ödal. I'm with charity Otti 2030. We're a registered charity. I'm particularly involved in a group called Retrofit and Energy Group. We have previously been doing some community energies in terms of solar power on community buildings, and including a big one on library. We're now focusing more heavily on retrofit work. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Caroline. Be interested to hear more about that later on in the workshop. Catherine. Selga. Janine.
Hello, hi everyone. My name is Janine. I work for Whitley Bay Big Local, which is a small community charity based in Whitley Bay, just a little bit out on the coast from Newcastle Gateshead. I joined in the role of Energy Community Coordinator a few months ago. So the community charity had for a number of years energy advice projects in the community. They run an energy cafe, which I now look after, and had funding through the redress scheme, particularly focusing on small energy efficiency measures in the community, and have done a number of events on community energy renewables over the time. I'm currently looking after a community DSO innovation trial with Northern Power Grid. So that's the reason how I came on board. And we are interested, based on doing the innovation trial and the energy advice work in the community, to think about how can we build on that? How can we have an even stronger portfolio to support the community we are based, to go bigger and bolder towards community energy.
Great, thanks, Janine. That sounds interesting. Liz?
Hi, there's actually 3 of us in the room here, but I haven't managed to get the camera working. So it's Liz, Matthew and Isabella. We're from a not-for-profit organisation called the Rural Design Centre, but we're working very closely with 2 community benefit societies, one in Northumberland and one across Durham, working with rural community hubs, so parish halls, community centres, village halls, community shops, a couple of community sports centres, things like that. And we are installing solar and batteries into these community spaces and bringing them all together in a cooperative approach within the community benefit societies. So that's 3 of us in one, which is good.
Right, thanks, for that, Liz. Patrick.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, all good.
My camera doesn't appear to be working, so I'll have to see what the problem with that is. Anyway,
No problem.
my name is Patrick. I am here as part of Community First Yorkshire, which is a charity working in North, East and West Yorkshire counties. And I'm in particular here representing a project called Village Green. And what we're going to be doing is working with rural communities within North Yorkshire to support them to kind of embark on their own community energy project journeys, essentially, in a bit of that work. So I'm here to learn a lot more about community energy projects, basically, and get some real detail. So very excited for the session. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Patrick. Paul.
Hi, Elliot. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Paul Homer. I'm from Acomb Community Energy, which is a community benefit society up in Acomb, just outside Hexham in Northumberland. We've been constituted for about 7 months now. We currently have a 1 megawatt solar energy scheme going through planning with Northumberland Council. So just trying to sort out the final details on that, some BNG issues. So we're constituted already. Our governance issue really is probably more around recruitment. So there's 3 directors, there's 3 of us involved. We're in a relatively small village. We're trying to recruit some specific skills around finance and legal support. So any advice on kind of how we do that? We've done some reaching out already to the community, but so far not had any luck. And we'd like to have those in place before we go to the next stage, which is our kind of fundraising round. So that's what I'm here for. Also, apologies, I'm a volunteer director. I've got a day job work meeting at 3 p.m. So I'm going to have to jump out. So I don't know. I'll try and jump back in. Apologies if I missed something.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, recruitment's definitely an issue when it comes to governance and community energy. So we'll definitely get make sure you have a chance to ask some questions and discuss that throughout the workshop. Who's next? Russell.
Hi there. Yeah, Russell Hoare, currently working for Doen Energy, which is actually my own entity. Previously, I was with Third Energy in North Yorkshire, which was a gas company, which I then transitioned into renewable energy, and then Seraphy Energy, which is a geothermal company. And what I've been doing for most of the last 2 or 3 years is helping community groups, either parish councils or CICs, get grant funding for feasibility projects. So I've done a lot of early stage feasibility, a lot of grant funding and project managing that. We're just about the point where some of those are now going to progress to the next stage, and therefore procurement and governance structure becomes much more relevant.
Great. Nice to have you, Russell. Walt.
Yeah, hi, I'm Walt. I guess I represent York and Leeds Community Energy. So I'll do bits of both of those. York's a community benefits society, I believe. I've had not much experience of how they've set up governance, so I'm looking to learn about it so I can actually comment. And we've got a variety of different projects at different stages.
Okay, thank you, Walt. I think someone might have joined during that. Andrew, I think. Have you heard from you?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Apologies, a bit late. Eventbrite wouldn't let me in, reset password, etc. I work up in Northumberland. I work for a charity called Community Action Northumberland. I work on various energy-related projects. We provide independent and impartial advice to householders. But I'm working on a project called CARE, Climate Action in Rural North East. It's a lottery-funded project, and an element of that is working with groups or working with community groups in terms of identifying energy solutions. We will help do community carbon assessments and then hopefully help these groups to progress, possibly to feasibility studies, etc. So I'm here wanting to expand my knowledge base and also network and connect with some of the organisations that are out there.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I think that's everyone. Looking at this list, I think there's a lot of people that have been to some of the previous workshops. If anyone's new to this workshop series, they hasn't been to one of the previous ones, you raise a virtual hand so you can see, because there's some repeated content after this that if everyone's seen it before, we might not need to cover it. So is there anyone new in the room? Okay, I think that might be a no. Therefore, I think I might skip the first section where we introduce who we are.
Elliot, I think Catherine and Andrew have raised their hands.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we did.
Sorry, I didn't see that. Sorry. Okay. Okay, we'll continue with it. Thanks, Andy. I was obviously looking in the wrong place. So a little bit about us, Scene. So we are a community and local energy specialist. So our core mission is to deliver energy and low carbon projects which are locally led, owned and managed. We operate as a social enterprise, so this means we actively invest in community energy and in technology solutions to support local energy across the UK. So I've been working in community energy since 2011, so 14 years now. We have 2 offices, one up in Edinburgh and one in Liverpool. And to date, we've developed various wind, hydroelectric, solar PV, low carbon heat and retrofit projects. We also have quite extensive experience in delivering community energy projects under the Great British Energy Community Fund, previously the Community Energy Fund. So in 2025 alone, we've successfully completed 11 phase 1 GBECF funded projects. And so together with those 11 projects, they covered a wide range of like heat and electrical demand types. So looking at domestic properties, factories, supermarkets, working with different stakeholder groups, so community groups, commercial partners, DNOs, different landowners, different commercial and financing structures. So we've got experience in looking at PPA agreements, local energy clubs, export agreements, that kind of thing, as well as various governance structures involved in these projects, which we'll obviously cover in this workshop. Also familiar with like the next steps and approaches to undertaking stage 2 development studies. So that's helping community energy groups take their projects from the feasibility stage, helping them apply to stage 2 funding, to carry out activities for getting investment ready, and eventual project management of the final development. And so an example of that is our recent flagship project, which is a 2.6 megawatt community-owned solar array near Dundee in Scotland. I think I might be right in saying that this is the largest community-owned energy project in 23-24. So next, a little bit about the funders of this workshop series. That's the North East and Yorkshire Net Zero Hub. There are no representatives from the hub today, so I'll be covering this section. They're one of the 5 regional net zero hubs in England. They're funded by the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. And their core aims are attracting and stimulating commercial investment in projects to progress net zero. So naturally, they're big supporters of local net zero programs. So they actively want to see an increase in the number and scale of local net zero projects in the region. And in doing so, they also want to increase and expand, regional knowledge. So that's through training and capacity building through events like this. So what does the hub do to support community energy? Well, primarily it manages the Great British Energy Community Fund, as I mentioned before. It also has designated capacity building program. So this includes carbon literacy training and a series of one-to-one and group support educational events. So the hub are now offering a series of online surgery sessions to complement this workshop that we also carry out with SEEN. So these are one-to-one sessions, which will be hosted by us, SEEN, and they'll basically give you a chance to ask specific questions and get some tailored advice on your own energy projects. When you sign up, you'll give some brief information on what you want to get out of the session, and we'll make sure that the appropriate expert from our team will join that, whether that's someone that knows the in-depth stuff on finances or technologies or governance. So we'll share that sign-up link at the end of this workshop. But you can essentially pick and choose a time that suits when you want to meet us. I think we're taking bookings up until the end of December for those at the moment. So we recommend getting on that, and everyone is eligible for 3 hours of surgery time with us. So quick overview of the Great British Energy Community Fund. So this is a grant scheme for urban and rural communities to develop community energy projects. There's up to £140,000 available for community-based organisations looking to develop a project or to undergo a feasibility study. So this funding is available for various stages of project development. So from first concepts all the way to having an investment-ready scheme. So it doesn't really matter what stage of project's in, you may still be eligible for some support. And I believe applications are currently open until 12th of November this year. And funding is awarded on a first come, first served basis. So early applications are advised. So this is the community energy team at the hub. So if you want to get in touch with anyone, just feel free to jot down some of these details. So there's Abby, who's the principal contact for this workshop series. She's the community energy lead at the hub. We also have Sue, who's the development officer, and Emma, who's a project officer. So any major issues or queries about the Net Zero Hub or services they provide are best directed to one of those 3 shown on screen. So the hub also has several members who are responsible for regional support. So you've got Lizzie, who's responsible for the Northern Tyne, George, responsible for South Yorkshire, Femi for West Yorkshire, Harry for Hull and East Riding, and Danny at Tees Valley. So if you have any regionally specific queries, feel free to send an email to one of these. So that's the end of the introductions. I'm going to pass over to Sandy now, who's going to take you through some key principles in governance. Sandy?
Hello. Sorry, just getting my camera on. Thank you, Elliot. Can everyone hear me okay? Nods, thumbs up. Excellent. Okay, so before I start, I just note that Russell, you've asked in the chat, has the Great British Energy Community Fund in the Northeast had any successful applications announced for this round? Russell, I don't actually know. I know that they were considering applications a couple of weeks ago, so they had a couple of gates a couple of weeks ago. I'd have to check that, but I know that there's likely to be decisions made relatively soon in that they need to spend money relatively quickly. What I would say is because this is later in the process and because these grant funds come from central government, so that things need to be allotted and the funding needs to be allotted in the financial year. I think we should be hearing from those who submitted in round one relatively shortly. That's the best I can give you right now. And I think it'd be a matter of contacting the hub to ask about any applications that have gone in and you haven't heard back from. So what am I going to take you through? I'm going to do my best to take around half an hour of your time to talk through governance structures in community energy, to talk through building capacity and strengthening your organization, which I think has already been raised as a point. How do you get people involved? How do you keep them involved? And how do you do that under different kind of different models of governance? And then we'll talk a small bit around partnerships. So how we approach partnerships with other community organizations, with the public sector, with commercial developers, that kind of thing. Now, this is a huge amount of a giant topic to cover within half an hour, so I'm going to have to be a little bit cursory around things, and there will be some elements of the slides which we bring up that I won't cover. Reason being that we will share the slides with you if you want to delve into it further. We can also point you to a whole lot of resources around governance and so forth, with my top recommendation being the resources section on Community Energy England's website, which has a whole lot of information and guidance on how to set up your organization. The other point before I start is I realize a lot of you have been through this process. I've already heard people mentioning being cooperatives, being charities, being community benefit societies. So I apologize if I'm reiterating on things you well understand, but we want to give a broad picture here. So to start with how you choose a governance model, it's not a simple process. It requires asking yourself a few questions. And effectively, within this presentation, I'm taking it from the point of we're an unincorporated organization. We want to take forward an energy project of some description. How do we go about setting up to do that? So these questions may seem simple initially, but they do take a bit of strategic thinking. We want to know, where's our income going to be coming from? Do we need to set up to take donations, for instance? Do we expect to be kind of deriving income from grants initially, and then potentially from outside investment or from selling of goods and services, so selling electricity or heat, for instance, or maybe products, looking at energy efficiency, that kind of thing. So we need to think about what our income streams will be and how we approach that. We'll then need to think about who our membership will be, whether we'll have a membership. Will that be people within your community? Will that be a subset of people in your community, a kind of a steering group, a board, and so forth, which is our point 6 down there, will we be able to bring in a membership from our local community or our community of interest? More broadly, what's the purpose of the organization? Is it for kind of delivering community impact, so supporting community programs? It could be health and well-being, it could be further energy projects, it could be just decarbonisation in general. There's a whole load of topics which we could include within that, but may influence how we set up. Quite importantly, whether your purpose as an organization is charitable or you expect it to be charitable in future. I'll get into this in a little bit, but setting up a charity can be a bit of a headache, and often it forms a slightly longer term goal when you're talking about community organizations within the context of community energy. And then lastly is the relatively boring stuff around contracts and banking and trading. Basically, do you need a bank account? How will you access it? How do you contract with outside parties, which we'll get into in the procurement side of things? Will we be selling anything? So energy would be one of those things. We're selling electricity. Will we require insurances and so forth? So all of these things will maybe be standard for most governance structures, but for some you might need to make special considerations, or for example, with charitable purpose, we might be aligning ourselves to being a charity. So tons of bits of information and decisions to be made, but it's really important to try and structure that at the outset so that you don't end up in a position where you're unable to undertake your activities or having to set up multiple different organizational types to achieve your goals. So I will take you through that just now. If you could just drop onto the next slide, Elliot. So the questions I want to cover are: why incorporate? Why not just continue operating as a group of interested and motivated people who want to achieve something? What's the benefit of setting up an organization? We'll then talk about how you choose a governance model, so comparing the various models that are out there and what's dominant in the community energy sector. We will then go on to how we strengthen governance. I think this is maybe one of the most interesting points, because it's often the most challenging part is not just the setup of the organization and selecting what type of organization to set up. It's how do we make sure we have the right people in place to run it? How do we make sure that the legacy of that organization continues over 2, 5, 10 years and so forth? And when we're talking about the energy sector, we might be talking about projects that last for 20, 30, 40 years. And we need to make sure that there's a plan in place and a process in place to make sure that that's achievable and that things continue to operate in a way that delivers impact. And then lastly, we want to talk about partnerships. So broadly, how do you get into a partnership? What are the possible contractual arrangements and so forth? So next slide. So why incorporate? There's lots of benefits to being an unincorporated organization. Not least, you don't have to go through the rigmarole of setting up an organization. So most community projects start on this basis. A group of individuals may decide to work together. It might form from a parish council working group. It might form from a few people meeting down the pub. But it's quite an organic thing. It's beneficial in that it's simple. The problem with it is that you're very limited in what you can do. So when we're talking in the context of community energy, maybe it's receiving grants, maybe it's entering into partnerships. You can't do that as an unincorporated organization. You need some legal form. So within these legal forms, we want to think about a few things. One is, when we incorporate, who's going to be liable? So who's on the hook basically for anything that potentially goes wrong, but also for what results from a project. So here we're talking about how we set up to make sure that our liability is either shared between individuals or kept within an organizational structure, basically limiting individuals' liability. So you don't want to be liable if your energy project goes wrong. You want your organization to be. When we're talking about ownership, ownership often requires contracts. It might be the contract to take on a lease for a piece of land. It might be the contract with your maintenance people for a wind turbine. All these things that you can't really do as an unincorporated organization. You need to set up a corporate body so that you can own property, that you can enter into these contracts in your own right. This may sound simple, but it's all, you know, the baseline we have to work on. Similar to liability, we're talking about risk. We want equal risks between people or within your organization that limits the risks to the individual as far as possible. Cost-wise, you know, as I said, it's simple and low cost not to incorporate. There'll be some small costs to the likes of setting up a limited company. We'll get into the different forms. You know, you can set up a limited company for, I think it's around £5, and it will take you half an hour. But when you get into setting up a charity, there's quite a time sink and a reasonable amount of expense involved in doing so. On the admin side, we do need to be a bit more careful when we're incorporated. We need to keep records of our incomings and outgoings when it comes to money. We need to keep records of our insurances. We need to keep records of our kind of annual accounts. All of these things that do require time and resource and money to achieve. And then lastly, there's privacy. So there's an element of not losing privacy, but as soon as you are an organization, things are tracked. People can access your details. So who you are as a director of an organization, for instance, who you are as a charity, and what your accounts say each year. So there's a level of scrutiny there that you maybe don't have at the unincorporated stage. That said, in most instances, we are talking about incorporation because we have to take forward projects, whether that's on the ownership basis, whether that's just having a bank account for a grant fund, anything of that nature. It's going to be a requirement. So let's talk about what the actual options are here. If we can go to the next slide. Lots of options. I'm not going to talk through them all. I'm going to try and split them up a bit. Kind of going from simple to difficult, or maybe just kind of the standard to the community energy specifics to kind of around partnerships and so forth. So at the top here, we've got associations. This is relatively straightforward. It's an organization that has a constitution. It has something that underpins it that says this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it, and these are the rules. Beyond that, there isn't anything particular that's going to benefit us from a community energy perspective, other than it can in time become a charity. The standard two types of company you'll see in the UK. Well, the main one will be your kind of private company, your company limited by shares. So these are typically for profit, owned by shareholders, and the liability is to the company itself. The use of limited companies by shares in the community energy sectors is not used as the main delivery vehicle, basically, for community projects. So you don't typically see community organizations setting up as private limited companies because lack of democracy that surrounds it that isn't quite community representative. What it does enable is a kind of simple means of operating commercially. So what you will see, and I will talk about this in a bit, organizations using companies limited by shares to own an asset. So solar panels or a wind turbine with a limited form of operation that only allows them to give money to a parent charity or cooperative or some other form of organization. So it does exist. It is used, often termed a special purpose vehicle, but it's not the kind of predominant form of governance in the community energy sector. Companies limited by guarantee are slightly different and typically include your non-profits, your kind of social enterprises and charities. The difference being that they're owned by their members. So that guarantee is from the members themselves. They act as guarantors, and they're often used where profits are reinvested in the operation of the organization, so kind of social enterprise model, or whether they're dispersed and donated to kind of within, say, a community to deliver impact. So there's a kind of slight difference there. Both of those forms, in their simplest forms, are relatively easy to set up. Requirement is that you're registered with Companies House. Again, relatively simple. There's annual accounts needed and so forth. They don't have an asset lock. Now, that's pretty critical. So an asset lock is where the assets of your organization, so that might be the physical assets, it might be the money in your bank account, etc. Any profit you make from energy projects can only be used for specific means, and they are locked by the constitution and the underlying documentation for your organization. So you set out what you're going to do, and you lock your use of funds, for instance, to that activity. Basically, it's a means of stopping people from taking control of the organization and using it for means it was never set up to do. If I give you an example, a community could set up as a private organization. It could earn money from a wind farm, and initially that money is being spent on reinvestment in the local community. If the directors of that company saw fit, they could then, without an asset lock, turn that surplus to anything they want. They could renovate their house. They could, basically there's no limitation on what can be done. So we really prefer an asset lock when we're talking about community governance. So on that basis, there's a few things here. We've got community interest companies. We've got community benefit societies, which are a form of registered society, so a bit like a cooperative, and cooperatives themselves. So you see them here as industrial and provident societies. All of those are well used in the community energy sector for those reasons, because they have asset locks, because they are underpinned by articles of association or constitutions, because they are regulated by things like by organizations such as the Financial Services Authority. So there are people keeping tabs on what you're doing with your money and making sure that it's spent on what you said you would spend it on. That's really quite important. The last step really is around charities. So again, as I've mentioned, it can be a bit of a challenging process to set up a charity. It's not a one-day thing. It typically takes a few months to get charities set up. And what we often see is community action groups or kind of associations pulling together to set up something. And that at the moment is the simpler forms of community benefit society or CIC, community interest company, and laterally moving to set up a charity or turn their community benefit society into a charity. So there are kind of ways of taking a kind of a process-driven approach to get into that stage. So I think I've gone through enough of what's on this page. Obviously, we'll share this, but there's quite a lot of complexity here, and as many in the room will know, there's more to it than just what I've got here. There's other options, but what we see typically, I will just run through on the next page.
We've had a question in the chat. Want to field that now while we're on the topic, or?
Well, sure. How easy is it to swap between the different models if circumstances change? Largely not that easy. So, as I said, things like a association or community benefit society, which is probably the dominant form right now, can be turned into charities. They can become charities in their own right. But if you were to say have a private limited company to turn it into a community benefit society, you are likely starting not quite from scratch, but you would set up a separate organization. Yeah, it's not easy to chop and change, basically, because of the differing requirements for each. So if we just move on to the next slide. If we talk about pros and cons for a little bit, so we're talking about the initial setup where we've got committees, action groups, often unincorporated organizations. We will have a membership, informal at least, but we won't have a formal constitution or articles of association, which are quite important, as we've discussed. What is useful about these organizations is that they can be set up with a charitable purpose, but they don't have any real mechanism for accountability. Without a proper structure, fundraising can be really difficult. Kind of formal fundraising and grant proposals and so forth are often extremely difficult from this position, if not impossible. And even just holding a bank account can be a real difficulty if you truly aren't incorporated. So you might be using personal bank accounts, which seriously lacks transparency and is far from best practice. We go a little further in, we get to associations. Again, simple constitutions, so it's a little bit more formal. Very easy to put together, little admin, but again, we still have these issues around liability to the individual, setting up a bank account, holding contracts, inability to raise funds. So whilst it's a good interim measure, it's not great in terms of particularly delivering out energy projects. So number 3 is where we see most activity in the community energy sector. As we've heard from people in the room, we have community benefit societies. There are lots of community interest companies out there, and generally companies limited by guarantee has been kind of overarching term. To split them up a little bit, so as the CIC, community interest company, is a non-charitable company. It's for the benefit of a community or has a social purpose rather than profit making. They tend to be used a little more where you have enterprises, so running services and that kind of thing, but they do pop up in the energy industry relatively frequently. Community benefit societies are really what has, if we step back 10 years, cooperatives were the dominant form of organization that were set up to run energy projects. Now, community benefit societies fills that gap. They're a little easier to set up. They have a similar structure. They have the benefit of being able to move to charitable status. And they offer all the kind of things that you want out of a company, from limited liability for membership. They give you that asset lock, meaning that there's a level of control you have underlying the organization about where you spend money. There's ensuring that your profits are guided towards what you said you would in terms of delivering community impact, making donations, a reinvestment in your service or your product when we're talking about community interest companies. And on the basics, holding bank accounts, holding contracts. The downsides of that is you're a company. You have to do all the admin work, track your finances, track your contracts, do annual accounting, report back to FCA, and if you set up a charity, to the Charity Commission. And you have to, as we heard already, one of the difficult things, hold a board of members who direct what is happening, who over the course of the lifetime of the organization are ideally of your community, who are able to run the organization, who are able to deliver on the objectives you set out, which underlie your organization, and that are re-elected or elected on a democratic and transparent basis. And then lastly, down the bottom, we have charities. I won't over-egg the point around the difficulty of setting up charities, but there are clear tax benefits to being a charity. You can access greater levels of funding as a charity, so there are funds specific to charities. You, again, hold the lack of liability to membership and so forth. You're really negatives there really be around the administrative side of things, around the regulations that limit what charities can do, and the timescales to get that set up. So if we just move on from here, how do we strengthen governance? So most of the time here, we're talking about your CICs, your CBS, your charities, the things that crop up most frequently. We want to look at the way you structure your board and who's in it. So you need, as I've said, ideally a representative cross-section of your community, whether that's a community of place or a community of interest, to deliver on your objectives in a representative way, to reach as many people within your community as possible. The size of your organization should be set. A size of your board should be set. So, setting out what the maximum of size of your board are. So that could mean, well, it has two considerations. One is a lot of competing voices in the same room can be difficult. So having a board of 20 is not ideal. We don't want to have a situation where there's inaction or disagreement because you have too many people on the board. Equally, you don't want two decision makers for an entire community. So there's a kind of best practice here around choosing the right number for the size of your organization, your operations, and your community. That could be 3, it could be 5, it could be 6, but we don't typically see boards going far beyond that number. So yeah, there's considerations there about how many people you involve at that decision making kind of end of your organization. Then composition. So we want a composition that's representative. We want a composition that's kind of hits all of not just the geographic parts of your community, but the social groups within your community and so forth. We want one that where there's representation from everyone you are trying to deliver impact to deliver benefit to. There's a process to be decided on how trustees and in your board are elected or appointed. There's lots of really good guidance on that side of things. Again, directing you to Community Energy England, but there's a best practice in the process you undertake to make sure you're inviting the right people to join, to make sure that when you're doing so, you're spending time on the engagement, because that's how you bring people in. You spend time to engage, tell people about the organization, your aims, the purpose of what you're doing. And on that next point below around roles, we need to be really clear about what the roles are within the organization. What does a board member do? What does an accountant do in your organization? What does the person in charge of HR in your organization do? Setting out their roles, their time commitment requirements, responsibilities really clearly, and then recruiting on that basis. So treating it a bit like a job advert. The problem is it's often a job advert for volunteer time, which, as I'm sure many in the room appreciate, is very hard to secure. Terms of office. So setting out how long people should be involved, whether that's terms of 1 or 2 years, 4 years, making sure that we have a balance of two things. One is representation, so allowing there to be turnover for new people to come in, bring in new ideas and new perspectives, but also an element of continuity. So as we see with the UK government, continuity is always an issue where we have an ever-changing cast of people in cabinets and governments changing between parties, where the priorities change and the sense of momentum in certain areas, especially the energy sector, are lost. This applies to community organizations, where we want to make sure we're choosing a length of term, or even having kind of crossover between different people on the board, so staggered terms of office, to make sure there is continuity, to make sure that things are managed in a consistent way. And then lastly, other attendees. So this is often about inviting people who maybe don't have the time, ability, inclination to be fully involved as a board member or trustee or so forth, but can play an important role in advising your operations. This might be people with legal expertise, financial expertise, and so forth. Again, this is difficult. Finding those specialist skills in your community is about engaging, telling people about the projects you're undertaking, inspiring them, getting them to commit some time, which is no easy task, but making it easy for people. You know, if you can get someone for 1 hour a month and they're really great at what they do, that's better than not getting anything at all. So it's a matter of kind of being flexible with people's availability. I won't go through everything at the bottom there, but we really do want to kind of highlight that including different perspectives and experience within boards, within the decision-making side of the organization, making sure that who is involved, that it's diverse, that it's inclusive to people in the community, that effort is made to seek representation, to include people who maybe find it more difficult. And that, well, basically, you often end up in scenarios where you have people who have the time, so they're maybe more well off, they might be retired, so forth. It's reaching younger people, people with young families, people who work full time and just really can't commit to this. It's a struggle. It's a real struggle to do so, and I think it is about finding interesting ways of engaging. So whether that's directly setting up email campaigns, whether it's door-to-door knocking, whether it's holding community events in spaces where you might have people who have young families, for instance, that kind of thing, trying to make sure that you're thinking about this from the point of those who might be involved and thinking about your engagement strategy to get these people involved. So next slide. So here we want to talk about session planning. Really important. I've kind of covered a little bit already, but this is about having a strategy to move between groups of people who will be involved in your organization. The organization may be an entity, but it is reliant on the people involved. It is based on the skills and expertise and experience of those involved in the organization. What we don't want is issues surrounding unplanned succession, where we're talking about people leaving because they're unhappy, they're unwell, their circumstances in life have changed, but that happens. It's really disruptive to an organization's operations, whether you're a private commercial company or a community organization. But planning for how you deal with these events is really important. That includes having a structured approach to board turnover, re-election, reasons that people might be triggered to resign from a board, making sure that basically any unplanned or unavoidable or urgent issues relating to staff capacity are kind of maybe not dealt with, but you have a plan to deal with them from the outset. There's some good ways to figure out not just how to do that, but how to recruit the right people around skills audits. So we often do this as an organization for our community clients, is we look at who they've got in the room, what their skill sets are. Often there's people who know more than we do about energy that we bring into our projects because it's really valuable. Equally, you may be thinking, work and we have no one who knows anything about money. So kind of recruiting on the basis of a need. So those sorts of skill audits are really worth doing. Again, having a recruitment pipeline. So who in your community has expressed interest and maybe doesn't want to be involved yet, or there's no space for them to be involved yet, and knowing that you can go back to them to bring them in later. So again, having these materials and things to prepare yourself for whether it's recruitment or whether it's for boards and trustees and so forth. All of this is structured around being proactive. That's what we want to be, rather than reactive over there on the right. All in all, this kind of process of being proactive, in theory, leads to a smoother transition between years, between parts of the project, whether that's the development phase, the construction phase, and so forth. It ensures there's a kind of continuity of knowledge, so that the information around your project and how it's delivered and everything that's come before is continued, not just in one cycle, but through the whole kind of cycling of board members, trustees, membership, and so forth. It reduces risks of any gaps in expertise in your organization, of sudden gaps in your governance, and probably one of the most important things here is it builds confidence with your funders and partners. If the same people are involved with the same knowledge and the same relationships over a longer period of time, and that those who are new are introduced slowly and given the chance to get to build the relationships with funders and partners, it makes things easier for everyone. It promotes trust, it promotes a good working relationship, and so forth. All well and good until you think about how much time that takes. You know, we're limited on time already. How can we do all of this and still run our energy projects, manage our feasibility studies, go through the development process, get our contracts underway, etc., etc. So, you know, this is all ideal. This is all about trying to build all of this in from the outset. Often it becomes quite ad hoc over the process of your organization. But I think in the energy sector, if I can take it to kind of examples, we might spend 2 years developing a solar array. So we had a 1 megawatt solar array mentioned in the intro. We built up a body of knowledge and a level of expertise in solar delivery within our community organization. During this process, we should be thinking about that operational phase, but how over the 25-year lifetime of these solar panels do we operate? How do we plan the succession? How do we make sure that there's a governance system in place that everyone agrees upon and is acted on properly? And it takes time, but it can be built into the development phase. Because if you get to the point where you have an operating solar array that's making money and you don't have the people in place to run that, to manage the profits, to disperse that within your community, then it's going to be really difficult at the outset. And you're also going to be scrabbling around to find people to do this for you, find people who are capable to run those first few years of your project. And then you'll be suddenly finding the next few years of your project to get more people in the door and so forth. So yeah, I think what I'm trying to say here is that considering these issues, even though you've set up as a CBS or CIC and you've got some studies in place, thinking about this early on is really important, because if you don't, you'll find a crunch at the point where you really need to operate as an organization that's making profit and using that profit to deliver impact. So a bit of a monologue from me, but I will give you a little bit more around partnerships in brief. And then I will pass back to Elliot to give you a little example and run a short activity with you. So partnerships, this is very, very cursory and very, very specific to the energy industry. But typically we might have a development partnership. So we're talking about the process of setting up an energy project. That might be a wind turbine, it might be a retrofit service, it could be a whole lot of different things. But this might require a partnership, whether it's your local authority, whether it's with the charity in your area, whether it's with a commercial developer. Typically at this stage, it can be an informal partnership to begin with, but it's always recommended to get some form of agreement in place. We're talking collaboration agreements or memorandums of understanding. There can be a cost associated where you want, whether it's expert input or particularly legal input. So building these sorts of things into feasibility stage or detailed development stage is quite important when you're working with partners. Beyond the development phase, we get into the kind of ownership of energy assets and energy programs. So there's 3 typical options we have here. And just in terms of context, shared ownership is being so say shared ownership. Shared ownership encompasses these next 3 points, being pushed quite heavily by the UK government through GB Energy. They're developing tools and systems to try and promote shared ownership of energy assets. It's something that's happened to some success in Scotland, where there is guidance from the Scottish government, which is quite interesting, but it is guidance, nothing is mandated. Where communities have got on board with commercial developers, with local authorities, with other communities to develop projects. We expect to see more of this coming through in the next few years. So I think it's a really interesting area and somewhere where community energy has a lot of growth potential, because we could be talking about pretty large energy projects here. So the 3 options we typically see at the moment are joint venture, where both the developer and the community own shares in the project. I'm going to keep this nice and simple and use one example for the 3. So we might have a small wind farm in Yorkshire somewhere. It's developer led. They are planning to put together this kind of, say, 5 megawatts of wind across a couple of wind turbines. A joint venture would be where the community and developer work together. They own 50-50, for instance, of the project, and they benefit through 50% of the revenues generated. So they have ownership of the assets themselves. Shared revenue is a little different. It can be simpler to secure from the community's perspective, because the developer wholly owns the project and is in charge of leading and delivering that. Whereas the community may just purchase a share of the project, project's profits. So basically, there's limited liability on the community side because they don't own the asset, but they still benefit from the project by investing in it. In essence, it's a bit like giving a loan to a developer and getting an income back from it that's tied to the revenue generation of the project. And then we have split ownership. So in this instance, we might have one site where one turbine is owned by the community and one turbine is owned by the developer. A bit like a joint venture, but they're developers in their own rights, and they are in charge of developing and delivering those elements of the system. This offers a benefit in terms of it can simplify planning permission. It can enable projects through shared grid connections. We see it occasionally, but it's not the dominant form of shared ownership. So that's a few options that we have. It's not all options for partnerships. Obviously, there's kind of grey areas in between lots of this, but that's what we typically see when we talk about energy assets. And I think my final slide is just around how we make partnerships work for communities. So the Southwest Cooperative developed their own set of governance rules. So it's all around making sure that partnerships deliver the best deal for communities, whether that be CICs, CBSs, cooperatives, charities. And it's really focused on the social purpose. So what we're trying to do here is make sure that any partnership agreement we get into or partnership contract we get into is aligned with our ambitions and our aims as a community. So that might be establishing the governance principles within the contract, so allowing whether it be a co-op or a CBS to put into these partnership agreements the principles that govern their work. And that can be difficult because commercial developers will push back on this sort of thing. But it's quite it's beneficial from the community's point of view. It should be considered best practice, but it's hard to achieve. Enabling the widest financing is one of the benefits, really, from a kind of governance and partnerships, because we're talking about, well, what are the options to raise finance from the community's perspective? Can we raise money directly from your community or within the region? Can we deliver benefit through the investment raising process itself? Often that's a kind of carrot to the developers, because they see this as a way to raise low cost finance that's, also offers the kind of acceptance they might hope for. So when we're talking about this wind turbine hypothetical that I've given you, developer might be keen to go through a community share raise for the community side, the community portion of the investment, because people who get to invest are more likely to be supportive of the project, and therefore the project is more likely to get planning permission, to see fewer objections, that kind of thing. We want to closely follow the principles that underlie the organization. We've kind of covered that, but around delivering consensus, retaining autonomy of the community organization within the partnership, ensuring a focus on sustainable development, for instance. And then finally, that any kind of monitoring and evaluation approaches must include kind of social impact reporting. So we're not just talking about how is this wind turbine or this wind farm performing financially. That works for the developer. They're happy with that. Their return on investment is key. But for the community, it's more than just return on investment. It's about social impact, whether that's through the investment itself, so the shares that the community members may hold, or whether that's through reinvesting profits from the scheme in the local community. So ensuring there's a kind of a framework and process there to evaluate and monitor the social impact of the project, and that's kind of clearly stated within the partnership agreements and how things should be assessed and appraised. So a lot of information, probably not a lot of answers for many of you, but I hope some useful tips and guidance. Like I said, lots of this will be shared with, well, this will be shared with you, so you can go in and interrogate, and please feel free to ask questions. But if I can now hand to Elliot to give you a quick case study, and then we can move on to the activity.
Yep, thanks, Sandy. So yeah, just leading on from what Sandy was talking about there at the end, partnerships and governance. It's just a quick example of how a new partnership model could be significant for community energy groups. So that's the Community Energy Catalyst. This was launched in 2025 by Thrive Renewables and Big Society Capital. So together they've committed around 40 million specifically for community-owned renewables. The focus of this partnership is on much bigger projects, so between 0.5 megawatt and 30 megawatts. So those are things like community wind turbines or large ground-mounted solar farms. So they're looking at projects that are already quite advanced. So with they've already got planning consent, already got grid connection offers, but where communities might actually struggle to raise that capital to build projects of that size. So why does this matter for community energy? Well, it helps overcome that capital barrier. Many groups can do feasibility studies, but they stall at the finance when there's much larger chunks of money is needed to bridge that gap between just feasibility and looking at what's possible and getting a large scale community generation development underway. It's also a partnership model that brings together institutional investors with community organizations. So risk and expertise are shared, but those community values are kept within the project. So a large commercial developer doesn't deprioritize some of the things that are integral to a community group's aims. And thirdly, a partnership like this helps scale up the sector. So instead of just looking at rooftop solar on small community halls or a small village hall, that doesn't have value. But with a partnership like this, we can now co-own much larger projects that really can make a dent in local energy systems and produce a lot of financial community benefit for a region. And then finally, it comes with government support. So that's not just money, it also makes projects less risky for smaller groups. So overall, it shows how communities can work with large finance actors without losing their ethos. As long as those roles and decision rights, as Sandy's been talking about in the last half an hour, as long as those roles and decisions are clear and locked in to how that organization operates. So that leads us into our first activity on decision-making in governance. We will go into breakout rooms, but I think since there's only 9 of us here, I think one large breakout room will suffice to get a good discussion going. So the scenario we're looking at, so you can imagine your group is developing a 500 kilowatt solar farm in partnership with the local council, but a commercial developer is also involved. So when developing this, there are 3 key decisions we need to make. We need to choose the contractor for installation of the solar farm. We need to set the tariff rate for the local supply customers. And we need to understand how to spend the community profits that will be produced by that solar farm. So in our group, I'd like us to open up the floor to try and make some decision-making decisions for each of the 3 decisions that need to be made. So again, as a reminder, the project is a partnership between the community board, between a local authority partner and a developer partner. Does anyone have any initial thoughts as to which of those might be best placed to choose the contract for installation, set the tariff, or spend community profits? Yes, Russell.
I think in terms of choosing contractor, the developer partner is probably best place for that. You certainly, local authority potentially if they've done other projects and have preferred suppliers. So, but I would say the developer partner is probably the best position because you've probably chosen that partner on the basis of them having projects in the past or experience of contractors.
Yeah, yeah. See, there might be any downsides to that at all?
Conflict of interest for sure. If they have preferred suppliers, then there's probably a reason for that. They may even own their own, service providers. So there's a risk with that. I mean, maybe to keep it honest, you have the help of the local authority partner as well on that. But yeah, so there is a risk. Yeah.
Yeah. So on that same point, choosing the contractor, does anyone have any thoughts on maybe one of the 3 partners that might not be best placed to make that decision? And any thoughts on setting the tariff for local supply customers? Is there anyone that any one of those 3 in the partners that might have some responsibility for making sure that the local community are being looked after well, that the tariff rate isn't going to be set at an unfair price?
I guess the community board is going to have the best interests of the local community at heart. But I guess you need to have a bit of a balance, don't you? Because they could get too generous and it could be financially not as viable as it might need to be able to make it commercially worthwhile for the developer partner. So in a way, there's kind of an agreed methodology about how they come up with the figure. Before you actually calculate anything, it's agreeing how you'll go about working out what that would be, maybe.
Yeah, that makes sense. Making sure it's balanced. And again, that all comes down to setting up your partnership in the beginning, making sure, all the documents are nailed down legally so there's no surprises further down the line and avoiding any conflict. But yeah, that's a good point. The local authority might also have some interest in setting the tariff. Local authorities, local councils, they have fuel poverty goals that they need to hit. So if some of those local supply customers are in social housing or something, in order to try and minimise the rates of fuel poverty across their area, it's going to be important for them. And then third point, how to spend community profits. Anyone, any thoughts on which of the three should have some say over that?
I guess again, it's the community board should already have done some engagement with the community to be established in the first place. So I guess they'll have had those links to understand what the community needs are and what they would like to have done.
Yeah. Yep. So a hand raise there, Janine.
Well, but I absolutely agree with you know, what you've just said. Community board seems to be best placed for that, and yeah, just fully agree to like the previous engagement. Hopefully they have already undertaken, and if they are at least to a good degree diverse representation on the community board, yeah, well placed for that.
Yeah, Sandy.
Yeah, I don't think I'm supposed to be adding my view, but there's one thing I thought that's come up before for us that's quite interesting if we talk about point one when we're choosing the contractor. That the presumption here is that the developer is the one that chooses the contractor, or potentially the local council, but that they have the processes and skills to be able to do so. They have the networks and contacts and everything, you know, they're set up to do so. But we found that when we're procuring, say, installation, the community should have a say because they have different decision-making factors. So, for instance, on a large solar array that we installed last year, the community organization wanted to ensure that any panels that were bought were ethical, that they didn't have any modern slavery within the supply chain, that they were the lowest carbon sourced panels that they could find, that kind of thing, which often doesn't show up on a commercial developer's radar. They're just looking for the lowest cost, best performing option. So yeah, it's often not quite as clear cut as you maybe think it might be.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess we'll touch on some of those points further in the procurement section on selecting an appropriate contractor. Russell?
I just wondered if anyone has got any experience of situations like this where there's been varied tariffs, because obviously communities are very different. You'll have social housing against large detached houses. I wonder if there's any examples where community groups have done it on ability to pay as opposed to a set tariff, and how that complicates things. Sounds as if no one's got that experience.
I could jump in a tiny bit where we've come across that situation with heat network development. So setting a heat tariff is really difficult. And there's this balance between offering something that's fair and offering something that makes the project work. So, you know, those that have less ability to pay, then you could maybe reduce certain rates. Those that have the ability to pay, so maybe you're non-domestic heat users, you could charge more. And that's how things work currently for most of them, is they are charged more for whether it's heat or electricity on the non-domestic. That's how there's rules emerging or just recently released on running heat networks that are starting to limit what you can and can't do. But yeah, it's a really interesting point, and it would take quite a lot of management, I think, to make sure that people aren't say conning the system. But you know, people will seek to benefit, and it's hard to means test and so forth for supply of energy. So I get where you're getting to, Russell, but it's complex, I think.
Yes, okay. Oh, you're muted still.
Hi. Yes, I'm just a bit baffled about this, as to me, on the tariffs that you can set, to me, you need to first solve getting the power from your solar farm to the individuals, which I'm assuming you're not building your own distribution system for it, and therefore the whole system of tariffs to me is a long way down the list, and you're more likely to be selling the power and distributing finance from it rather than having a tariff arrangement with individual community members. Thank you.
Yeah, Helga, I think you're right that we're not really in a market situation where you can supply electricity like that without, as you say, your own distribution network. I mean, I'm talking from the heat perspective, and there are certain circumstances where you can supply electricity to single or kind of a few locations within a complex site. But yeah, I think that's maybe moving into the technical configurations aspect rather than governance decision making.
So, do you have any information on the rules for allowing you to supply directly over the
Yes,
distribution network?
I do. I don't want to get into it in too much detail in this meeting just because of the focus of it. But we're seeing a few changes to the balancing and settlement codes. Lots of regulatory stuff around. They're called P441 and P442, which allow at least P442 is active, P441 is pending, which allow you to do certain elements of local energy supply or local electricity supply. But we're seeing moves in the sector towards allowing local electricity supply, though it's not quite there yet.
Thank you.
Okay, any final thoughts from anyone before we take a short break? No? Okay. So I suggest you take a 10-minute break and we'll reconvene at 3:36, and then we'll carry on with the procurement side of the workshop. So see you all in 10 minutes. Okay, welcome back. Give a minute for people to trickle in, and we'll start with the second half. People just want to give a thumbs up when they're back, or switch their cameras on, or some kind of indication. Thanks. Thank you. Great. Okay, I think that looks like just about everyone. So,
Elliot, can I ask a question before you start with the next
Absolutely.
section?
Yep.
Just without wanting to overcomplicate things before, when it's just I've got it rattling around my head, the difference between these heat networks and then the projects that you're describing here. I mean, they are big projects, and I'm assuming, you know, several megawatts of energy supplied is going to go, you know, to more than one, well, whether it be a household or a commercial business or what have you. And I know rattling around in the background, we've got Ofgem who are currently, you know, consulting, and there are going to be rules coming forwards in terms of how energy networks are maybe managed. And I think that will also feed into things like feed-in tariffs or whatever tariffs are charged. So I don't know if I'm sort of putting it all out there in terms of what's going around in my head. What these projects we're looking at here are not heat networks, are they? They are energy projects, but what is the difference between them and an energy heat network? I suppose is a good way of surmising what I'm trying to say.
I think I can maybe take this one. I guess what we're talking about here is quite generic around the governance and procurement aspects that apply to all of these projects from a community perspective. I think differences wise, I mean, there's a whole lot of differences, but effectively, when we're talking community energy, this is ownership of energy assets, whether that's a wind turbine as a generator or a heat pump as a heat generator, or even potentially energy efficiency kind of improvements to community halls. All these things have a kind of similar approach applied to them that we're talking about today, whether that's from the governance or management or procurement perspectives. I don't really know how to delve into the differences between them, because obviously there are fairly drastic differences. I think if we take the two dominant forms that you're talking about with heat networks and electricity generation, what we typically talk about in electricity generation is putting infrastructure in place to generate energy and send it to the national grid, because there's a national grid of electricity that runs around the UK. With heat, we're talking about more local projects. We're talking about generating communal heat potentially and servicing a community with that, which is much more, well, it requires the heat generation to be local, the supply to be considered, and so forth. So that's maybe where the differences are.
That's helpful. Yeah, that's helping me to sort of see the where my sort of brain thoughts were going. No, helpful. Thank you.
But yeah, there's intricacies within that where there's, you know, different crossovers and complex ways to do things. But yeah, simple breakdown, I guess.
Yeah, and I appreciate it's a difficult question to be asked because it itself covers so many sort of different aspects. But no, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to the procurement section then. So I'll take you through firstly different procurement pathways. So what different routes are there to go about selecting a contractor for different kinds of activities that you're going to come across as a community energy group. Then considerations, so we'll look at the risks and potential mitigations that you are probably going to need to be aware when it comes to procuring different contractor types. And then finally, we'll look at procurement in practice. So where do you actually go to start procuring? What needs to be included in any tenders you put out to make sure you're finding the right people? And then how do you evaluate the responses you get to those tenders as well? And that'll lead us on to a short activity at the end as well. So procurement pathways, there's kind of three main ones. There's direct award. So these are typically when a public contract is awarded without a competitive tendering procedure. So with this, it's often used for like small projects or where only a few specialist suppliers exist. Benefits of this way is it's very fast, it's very simple, there's much lower admin needed, and it can build strong relationships with trusted contractors. You can go back to the same ones. The cons are you're likely to get less competitive pricing. So obviously if you put out a tender for competition, people are going to be competing with each other, and that's going to drive the price down a bit. So with that comes risk of poor value for money, which can be a big issue when you're spending grant money, for example. There's also potential for a perceived lack of transparency with the contractor that you're going with. So again, these are for typically small scale projects, ones with low contract value, and where there's trust and a track record with a supplier that already exists between you and the contract themselves. So there's competitive tenders. So this is where you get multiple bids and compare them against agreed criteria. So these are open calls for bids from multiple suppliers. You will likely score these against a set criteria that you've defined that matches the values and your aspirations for your community energy project. And this is a more formal process than the direct award. This comes with specific published documents that need to be transparent and accountable. And in contrast to the direct award, it's going to encourage competitive pricing. So, like I said, you might get a better price or better value for the work that's been carried out. And this also allows the weighting of the different elements of what you prioritize as being your community energy project's aims. And our activity will talk about this a little bit more. Cons of a competitive tender, again, opposing to direct award. These are time and resource intensive, so they can deter smaller local suppliers, and there's a risk of a race to the bottom on costs. And they tend to be for projects with larger capital costs, so large solar farms, heat networks, that kind of thing. It's also needed for when funders require transparency and where multiple suppliers might exist. Finally, there's also partnership procurement. So that's using another organization's existing setup framework, which lists trusted contractors. So for this, it can be joint procurement with your partners, or community groups may actually have a formal role within those frameworks. So some pros of this approach: it saves time and admin. You don't have to put together all the documentation like you do with competitive tenders. You get access to vetted suppliers, and you can leverage this partner expertise in finding the correct contractors as well. I'll have a few examples of these kind of frameworks in the following slides. There's also less community control over this process using frameworks, since they may not prioritize local or social value. And there's also a risk of misaligned priorities with that partner. But it can be used, or it's quite often used in projects with local authority or housing association partners, or when specialist frameworks already exist. Now, there are these three pathways, but it's kind of important to note that for community energy organizations, you're not always restricted by strict procurement requirements because you're not yourselves a public body. So you can often go out with kind of however simple or complex procurement methods you want to. Obviously, that's not recommended because you need to help mitigate some risks. But the thing is, community energy groups and the activities you're involved in are often grant funded, such as from the GBECF. And so with that, you're going to be subject to very specific procurement requirements that you're going to need to be aware of before you start going out for contracting. And obviously this is to ensure that, well, the funders want to know that their money is being spent properly and wisely, so that, you know, they are really on you need to be transparent with why you're going with a certain contractor over another one, and that you're not just using a preferred supplier where there might be some conflicts of interest. So, for example, in the GBCF, you're required to obtain at least 3 tender responses that you evaluate. And then, you know, sometimes through this 3 response tender process, there can still be a preferred supplier. But if you go through the process, you can still show to your grant funder that you have gone through the process, and that even if they were preferred prior to going out to tender, they meet all the requirements needed, and they're a good contractor to take your project forward in whatever way that is. So just thinking about some considerations for procurement of different contractors. So you might be looking for a consultant to do some feasibility studies in phase 1 or phase 2 development studies, or even project management of your final development. So you're going to want to procure them at quite an early stage. It could be a wide range in quality, costs, and experience of these consultants. And a direct award or a small competitive tender is quite typical for this contract type. There are obviously going to be some issues, such as over-reliance on one single consultant, the variable community energy expertise, so some might not be that experienced with, you know, some of the specific points that experience is needed for when developing a community energy project. And there can also be risk of scope creep and rising costs, so you might want to embed something into your tender procedure to minimize that. So some ways to, you know, address those potential risks: you want to be checking that they are community energy specialists, or at least have some experience with community energy. You want to make sure they've got a clear scope of work and deliverables lined out in their response to your procurement. And you want to also consider framework or call-off consultancy support for flexibility. Next, we have metering and billing contractors. So this could be special suppliers, might be quite few in number. These are often bundled with software platforms, and the procurement may be partnership-led. So this is with a local authority or a housing association. So because they're quite specialist and fewer number, there's a bit of risk of poor customer service, which could, you know, damage trust with you and whoever the community that's benefiting from the development. And there can also be some complex data handling and GDPR compliance issues with these kinds of contractors that needs to be ironed out within that tendering process. So again, some mitigation strategies of those issues and risks. You want to evaluate the user friendliness and support of the platforms they use, that the community customers of your development will be interacting with through them to access their metering and billing records. Again, we want to be checking their community energy track record. Do they have experience in community energy? Are they community energy specialists in that way? Always best to get specialists involved if possible. And again, ensure that there's plenty of transparency on the fees and the contract length with this kind of contractor, which is all the kind of thing you can list in your in the documents you prepare before going out for tender. Next, construction contractors. So usually these are the highest value contractors. This is where lots of your capital costs are going to go towards. Competitive tender is common for these much larger contracts. And these contracts will cover things like the design, the build, and the commissioning of the development. So, of course, with construction, you're getting risks such as insolvency or long delays with the construction itself, or over or under specification of the development, which can lead to all sorts of conflicts, and health and safety compliance of the contractors. So again, when you go out to tender, you want to be making sure that the technical specification of your development is clear. And obviously that comes with phase 1 and phase 2 development studies. You want to make sure that you are going to get performance guarantees and warranties from those contractors. And once again, that the community values are like embedded into that contractor's, how they operate. So do they use local labor to carry out their construction? Do they, sponsor apprenticeships, and just ensuring again that community values are embedded into their practices. And that's similar for operations and maintenance. Different kinds of contracts. Obviously, these are smaller contracts, but over a much longer term. And you've got solar PV developments that are up to 20, 25 years. This is how long those O&M contracts need to last. And these are often direct award. They're used if a trusted local firm exists, they'll be regularly coming to the site to carry out their activities. Some risks of this kind of procurement. So you can get poor service, which might affect revenue. Obviously, the things like solar panels, the efficiency in which your solar panels operate makes a big difference to the kind of revenue you make. So making sure that the maintenance of the panels is done regularly to a high standard is critical to ensuring the viability of that project is good over the entire project lifetime. And contractors may also deprioritize small projects. So again, this needs to be embedded into the tender process to make sure that they have the ability to give a smaller, potentially smaller community project the time it needs. So again, just ensuring that these kind of contractors, that the agreements include performance standards, response times, making sure they're available when they're needed, balancing cost with reliability, and considering local providers for better responsiveness. So these are just some examples of where you can go to find contractors. So the top 3 are the examples of frameworks. So they've got listed different contractors that are accredited and well known across the sector. And then other places you can find contractors that might be of interest are Community Energy England. So you can find members. These will be all sorts of contractors that have a wealth of experience of working with community energy groups. These are the specialists, community energy specialists you'll be looking for. And in Local Energy Scotland have the same kind of list there. So I won't go through that in too much more detail, but when you get access to the slides later, you can come back to this slide and use those links if you're looking to find some contractors for procurement. So furthering procurement in practice, touched on some of this already, but when you've got some activities that you need to go out for tender with, you need to start thinking, okay, what exactly do we need to include in any documentation we're sending out to make sure that we get the best person for the job? So you want to be looking at technical, so how will they actually carry out the task? Their experience, are they qualified? Do they have experience doing similar things in the past, particularly with community energy groups? We want to know about their quality assurance practices. So what procedures do they have in place to ensure quality control, to make sure that all the work is done to a high standard? What do they do to address any risks? And do they flag any risks? The resourcing, do they have the personnel and capacity to deliver within a specified time frame? Particularly grant-funded activities are often limited by time in some ways, so you can make sure that there aren't going to be long delays, that they can resource it appropriately. Of course, price, how much are they quoting for? And then some more critical things for community energy groups are social value. So what additional value may this contract bring to your community? Do they invest in community energy projects across the country? Do they provide local training? And that can also be around sustainability as well. So do they carry out sustainable practices in their organization? Are they committed to reducing their carbon footprint, kind of thing? And then I think, as Sandy mentioned earlier as well, ethics can be quite a big part of making sure our contractors, how their ethics align with the ethics of the community energy group. So are they sourcing their solar panels from ethical sources that aren't potentially involved in modern slavery, things, that kind of thing. So community energy groups often add into their tenders a requirement just to list how a particular contractor might meet the social and sustainable and ethical values. So once you've asked that of your contractor, you're going to hopefully get a few responses, and then you've got to think, well, how do you actually evaluate those tenders? So you're going to think, how well do they actually answer your questions? Does the organization align with your values? Are those responses good enough? Are the prices realistic? And then once you've got all of that, it's quite common to then use a scoring process. So again, you can decide exactly how you want to do this, but you might want to set your tender into different sections and then score each section out of 100. So maybe you can have multiple people on your board that go through the different tenders and each give a score, and then you kind of create an average out of those scores. And what you also will need to do is create a weighting of those different evaluation elements. And that weighting is quite critical to ensuring that you're embedding those community priorities directly into the process of procurement. So you have pretty much free reign of setting how different elements of procurement are weighted. So for example, you might allocate 30% of the weighting to price, 40% to social value, and 30% to technical response. So those can be weighted any way you want. And then that weighting percentage is applied to the marking score, and then you're going to get a final score produced, and you can directly compare the different contractors that have responded to your tender. And that, that has not repercussions, but that just shows how transparent you're being with your procurement process, and that the grant funder can see exactly the process you've been through to selecting the correct contractor. So I've gone through that quite quick. That leads us on to the second activity, which is about that weighting. So similarly to the last activity, we can imagine that we're a community group, we're procuring an installer for a solar PV project on a local building, and you've got 3 priorities, but you must decide how much weight to give each one of those priorities. So you need to be allocating 100% across each 3 of these categories. So one is the technical and quality response from the tender. So this includes exactly how they're going to carry out the work, the experience of the organization, how they manage risk and the due diligence they do to ensure that everything is to a high standard. Price and financials, so how we've been quoted the capital costs, operation management and maintenance costs. And then finally, your community and social value. So looking at how the contractor might boost local jobs. Do they have low carbon supply chains? Do they have fair work policies? That sort of thing. So does anyone have any thoughts on how you might go about creating that weighting? What are the different situations where you might, I mean, what would be a situation where you'd allocate a higher weighting to price over community social and social value? Or what would be a situation where you'd allocate a higher weighting to community and social value over price, for example? Does anyone have any thoughts?
Whoops. Hi. The first thing that struck me was that I'd like the technical and quality to be weighted very strongly so that the project didn't fall down in the community because we had chosen someone who wasn't good at what they were doing. So I do kind of tie the technical and quality with making sure that the community has value. And to answer your question, I think it's all about ultimately finding value for community. So the price is less important to me than community and social value, which goes hand in hand with competence and the care that the company has, skills and care.
Yeah. So if you're going to apply an actual weighting to that split up, would it be something like 50% technical, 30% price, 30% community, and then leaving price as the lowest?
So 20. Yeah, that sounds good as a starter.
Yep, thanks. Helga, you got your hand up?
I feel that the price in the end is going to greatly influence the community value getting out of a solar project in terms of how much you can afford to do. And therefore, I would balance the technical quality and the price and financial slightly higher than Caroline. I would have said 40, 40, 20.
That's 20 for community and social at the end.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess like you said, if you got a large scale solar farm and it's going to cost way too much, then the revenue you generate and the amount you're going to be paying back to whoever raised that capital is going to start offsetting the amount of money that can be used for community benefits. So yeah, that's a good point. Any other thoughts?
I think
what was that again? What was the Helge's suggestion?
40% for technical, 40% for price, and 20% for community.
Okay.
As I think in terms of the choices in terms of solar, 95% of them are manufactured in China anyway. And whether you're in a position to influence a good Chinese versus a not so good Chinese product is challenging in my view. But maybe you can find some differentiation in there, and therefore I'm suggesting a lower percentage on number 3. But obviously the installation itself is a significant component of it, and for that the local bit is important. But the main components, to me, you have less opportunity to do things for community, other than getting a lot of it at a low price, at high quality.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, sometimes trying to embed community and social values, you're not always going to have control over that if the supply chains are quite locked in anyway. And so reducing the weight to that, putting more weight into the pricing means you can lower capital costs and potentially produce more revenue and inject that back into the community, which of course, full circle comes back to increasing social value at the end of the project anyway. Paul, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, hi. Apologies, I've pretty much missed the last one. I have missed the last hour, so this might have already been said. But I would think when you're coming to go to tender in the first place, hopefully you're choosing contractors that you know have already got the technical experience and the quality, you know, based on what they've done previously. And therefore, my instinct would be to reduce the weighting of that, as Helga said, compared to the price and the financials, which I think has got to be crucial, because if that doesn't add up, then you really can't deliver it. And the community and social value, I think, because what we're talking about here, I think for all of us, is community energy in one form or another. Effectively, the value is in the scheme itself, and of course you want a contractor that's going to reflect your values, but if you can't always get that, it's about delivering the project. If you can't deliver the project, that's got to be the fundamental. So I'd probably put price, it's probably 50%, I would think, maybe even higher, I'm not quite sure. Yeah, that feels like the most important one to me.
Yeah, the price 15, and then technical after that, I guess, and what you were saying, and
yeah, or maybe even 50, 25, 25, I'm not sure, or 60, 20, 20, something in that region would be my kind of instinct. But obviously, I guess part of this discussion, what comes out of it is that it's up to individual organisations to choose what works for them, because there might be some organisations who actually, this is the fifth time they've done this, they're putting solar on a community building, it's a different kind of project, and they feel really experienced, and they're working maybe even with the same contractors because they've had a good relationship. So then the community stuff might get higher in that scenario because they're very confident on the technical and quality. So I suppose it's about being appropriate to your project.
Yeah, definitely. I guess that's good. These kind of discussions and workshops get people thinking maybe about slightly different priorities, or maybe if they were thinking of weighting community and social value really high, going all the way and thinking that, okay, that might mean like best price, and then the overall stability of the project might take a hit, and not provide the social value that the project's supposed to do anyway. So yeah, good point. Any other thoughts from anyone? No? Anyone from C, anything to add?
I could add a little bit just on what we typically see. So often, when we're talking public procurement particularly, but communities often follow similar templates that are provided by the likes of Community Energy England or other community organisations, or from advice from, say, the Net Zero Hub and so forth, that we end up with kind of technical and quality being about 60 to 70%, and price being around 30 to 40%, depending on the nature of the contract. And social value often often isn't included, but it might be 5%, it might be 10% maximum. We're seeing an increase because public contracts have to include the social value aspect. But we have worked with community organisations who have put a good 5 to 10% for social value, 5 to 10% for for kind of sustainability and so forth, because they tend to be a greater priority compared to maybe the way the public sector does it. I think there's often a little bit of a difference between the stage you are in the process. So when you're talking about, say, a feasibility study where you get a grant for X amount of money to conduct the study, you're actually incentivized to focus more on whether it's technical or social value, because you have that money committed and you, I say, might as well spend it. You still want to be competitive, but the option is you hand it back to the funder. And to be honest, most funders don't really like you doing that because they've allocated funding, and that often just disappears back into a central pot of money. Later in the process, where you're talking about, say, construction, you might put a bit more to the pricing because it's so critical that you don't surpass your investment amounts. So the amount of loan you're expected to take or the share raise that you're conducting, what can you viably raise? So there's a kind of, it changes throughout the process, but often we see a kind of 70-30 technical to price, maybe a little bit of that partitioned off for the social value aspect. And people may disagree with that. Sometimes I disagree, but it's interesting to hear people putting quite different values out there.
Yep, I agree. Any other thoughts on this topic before we move on to a more of an open roundtable discussion where you'll get a chance to field some questions or give some experiences in governance and procurement? No? Okay. We would do to have another 10-minute break here. How is everyone's stamina doing? They happy to continue through, finish off, or see plenty of thumbs up? Okay, we'll skip the break. Sandy, over to you for the roundtable discussion, and can open up questions at this point as well.
Sure. So this is an open session. I don't really want to speak anymore because this is an opportunity for people to share experience, to ask questions. You can be as specific as you want, but it's really around governance and procurement and your experiences, your issues, anything you really want to address. So feel free to just stick a hand up to ask us about any content that we've presented already, or just to ask something that you've been dying to ask for the last couple of hours, but we've been talking. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, thanks. Apologies if you covered this when I wasn't present, but just coming back to the point I made at the start of the meeting about recruitment, going back many years with a completely different hat on, there used to be this great organisation called Arts and Business, and if you're in the arts, you could go to them and say, I need this skill as an advisor to my organisation, or I'm looking for this skill to recruit onto my board. And I wondered if there were any similar organisations in the community energy sector that are kind of, what used to be called almost like a dating service, that you're kind of you're pairing up a community energy organisation with people with skills and experience that might be beneficial, whether it's something that DESNY does or something that the Yorkshire North East Hub do, or any other organisation. I'd be really interested to learn about that.
Not at the national level that I'm aware of. Are you talking about recruiting for kind of paid roles, for instance?
Well, actually, the specific thing I'm thinking about is I'm trying to recruit for directors of the CBS, so it wouldn't be paid. But
okay.
Because, it's the same.
Yeah. That's difficult. It depends if you're looking locally, which is a little different to the kind of matching, maybe a little further afield. I think in the Northeast, I know, there are kind of skills hubs and so forth related to the net zero hub. So I think mentioned in one of our slides, Harry Barros is a good contact. I think he might be a little limited geography wise. But he works for, 2 seconds. the Business Growth and Skills Hub, which he may be able to help. I think that it covers the local enterprise partnership area, so the same as the Net Zero Hub. His details are on the slides that we can share, but
Stanley just dropped out.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Give it a moment.
I'm thinking aloud now. I suppose the other thing would be local kind of voluntary community action organisations. I can't think what the local one's called in Northumberland, but there's those in every region tends to have those, doesn't it? Community, what are they called? I'm looking at you, Elliot, as if you know. But yeah, there's organisations that bring together different community organisations and kind of for governance to support with funding and training and that kind of stuff. I wonder whether they might be able to help.
Or do you think, so here in North Tyneside, that's VONE for us,
Okay.
VONNE, who do, you know, working for a charity in North Tyneside, they would do the kind of like networking, skills shares and all of that. I can have a look and, you know, could send something over to you depending on like how big their reach is. But yeah, VONE is definitely active across North Tyneside.
Yeah, please do. I'm more than happy for my email to be shared after the meeting. So yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah. Paul, I'll jump in there. Did you mention you were Acom based?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I work for Community Action Northumberland. Is that one of the organisations you were thinking?
Yeah,
of?
I know Fiona Knox in the organisation, and one of your other colleagues whose name Andy. Someone? No, you're
Yeah.
Andy.
So Andy Deans. Andy Deans.
Andy Deans. That's it. Yeah. I know
Yes.
Andy Deans.
Yeah. So the project that we're working on, and by all means have my details. We can have a conversation offline, kind of thing, and just see how we can help. But if you're already talking to Fiona, what's the project you were looking at doing again?
Yeah, it's a 1 megawatt solar array for community owned by the community in Acom.
Yeah, so I think it's a conversation that my colleague Anna covers that area. We'll certainly, as an independent charitable enterprise, more than happily have a conversation with you, signpost you in the right direction if we can't help. And we've got funding officers who can provide guidance around funding and the governance side and what have you as well. I'll pop my details in the chat there, and by all means, give us a message and we can carry that conversation on.
That's super. Thanks, Andrew.
sorry about that. I wasn't keeping an eye on my battery. My laptop died. Did you manage to conclude that discussion, or is there anything else I can add?
I've had two very good suggestions from the group, Sandy. So I don't know what else you might have to add, but yeah, it's been helpful.
I mean, I think all I would add is that I know this sort of thing is a real struggle, getting people to commit time and finding the right person to do it. I think, you know, there are typical engagement, typical recruitment routes that, you know, if you're setting out exactly what you need and so forth, that going to the likes of, it might be Community Energy England, where they'll do job postings for you. They have a platform called Lumio, if you haven't come across that yet, which is good for seeking kind of advice from the community energy sector. Lots of really interesting and talented people on there. Otherwise, yeah, I don't have any kind of matchmaking services to recommend, frankly.
That's great. Thank you.
Any other questions from anyone in the room? Seems like a no. Okay, I will let Elliot talk you through the one-to-one support we have coming up as well. Well, we have available as well in the next couple of slides. But I think, yeah, I'll pass it back to you now.
Yep, thanks. So this was the 4th of 5 workshops. So we've already had one on project management, low carbon technologies, the connection process. So if you're interested in any of those and you weren't attending, we can get some materials across to you. And of course, this one and next week is the final one on commercial case development. Kind of our financial specialist, Ross, will be leading that one. So I'll have some interesting things to say for that. That's next week. 7th of October, 2 to 5 will be same kind of format as this. And as stated before, we highly recommend signing up to these one-to-one surgeries with us. As I mentioned near the beginning of the workshop, upon sign up, you're going to give us some information on what you need some advice on, and we'll make sure that the correct expert is there in the room with you to discuss your specific needs of your community energy project. So you can sign up with that link there. I think we'll also circulate the links more precisely after this workshop. The workshops are running, I think, into early next year, but currently you can only book slots up until December. And you have the 1 hour slots, and everyone is allowed up to 3 hours of time with us in those surgeries. So highly recommend to get booked in for those. And I think that about gets us to the end. I assume no final questions before we end. And if not, we can finish it there.
Thanks, Andy. Really helpful.
Thank you both.
No
Thanks,
problem.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew.